Sony have been pioneering in the cinema camera space as of lately, and especially so with the FX6. Now what we have with us today is a camera for those people who enjoy a compact cine camera and the form factor of a standard mirrorless camera. This is the Sony FX3 and it's their brand new full frame cinema camera, and we're super excited to see what this little thing can do. So let's dive into the features you guys want to know about in the FX3. First off, it uses a back illuminated full frame 10.2 megapixel sensor, and when you're using it for photography, it shoots in 12.1 megapixels. In addition to that, you have an ISO range up to 102,800, and you can expand it up to 400,000 if you really need that lighting push. Furthermore, because it is using a full frame sensor, you get all the benefits from it, such as low light performance, really nice looking bokeh, and 15 stops of dynamic range. So you have a lot of range to move when you're working with the files in post. In terms of video formats, you can record 4K up to 120 frames per second internally, which utilizes the full sensor. In addition to that, you can record full HD. Furthermore, in terms of codecs, you can record 10-bit 422, and when outputted externally to a recorder, you can record 16-bit RAW. Now, unfortunately, we do just have a pre-production model of the FX3, so we can't share the raw external features. However, we will be sharing samples from the internals later on. Inspired by Sony's Venice colorimetry, the Sony FX3 does utilize S-Cinetone by default. So if you do use any other FX cameras, it's really easy to match your footage if you do decide to use this as a B camera, for example. Furthermore, as you would expect from a Sony camera, for those handheld run and gun shooters, it does have in-body image stabilization. And as expected from Sony, it does utilize a pretty good autofocus system. When Josh and I were out earlier testing out the autofocus, it does have a multi-point phase detection autofocus system, which is quite snappy in video as well as photo. But most importantly, it does adopt the eye autofocus technology that Sony is well known for. And most of the time, it did work quite well, and we're quite impressed, especially for a cinema camera, to have such great autofocus and eye autofocus tracking inbuilt. And finally, it does have an inbuilt fan, and you can see the vents for that on the side here, basically keeping your camera cool for all those long video recording sessions. In fact, you can shoot uninterrupted 4K up to 60 frames per second. So if you do decide to do a broadcast or a lecture or a service, you can get the most out of this camera. And now I'm just going to talk about the external features of the FX3, and this is probably the most exciting part for me about the camera. It is super compact without the top handle, and it is lightweight. And you'll be really impressed holding one of these because they're deceivingly light, and especially with all the features that are inbuilt, it's actually incredible that they could load so much into this camera. Furthermore, what I really like about this design and that's super unique is that it does utilize a cageless system. As you can see around the camera, there are multiple screw points, and basically you don't need to utilize a cage if you want to mount extra accessories onto it. If you want to mount an arm with a monitor, you can just screw it directly onto the camera, giving it a really small form factor. Other benefits I can also see about the compact lightweight body is for those who want to mount it onto a gimbal or use it in an action field scenario. This camera is going to be a great camera to complement on a gimbal because it is so lightweight, and the size of the camera and the actual shape of the camera is just like a standard camera, and that's what most gimbals are balanced to anyway. So you don't have to go all out for a super expensive dedicated cinema camera gimbal. You could probably get away using a Ronin, for example. And I think for a lot of people who are on a budget and are looking to do a run and gun setup with a cinema camera, the FX3 is going to be a great camera to complement your gimbal. The FX3 also has all the video buttons that you need, and I'm going to dive deeper later on what I love most about them, but it's got all the features that you need. It's got 2 record buttons as well. It's got one at the front, one at the top, And it's laid out in a way that is super easy to access, so you don't have to dive too deep into menus. Furthermore, something that is very unique and not standard in a cinema camera is it does have a shutter button for photography. And it's just like how you would use a normal camera. So you half press to focus, full press to shoot. And if you are utilizing a power zoom lens too, it does have a little trigger at the top here. You can move left and right to zoom in and out. And speaking of which, for photography, we did use this camera outside for photography earlier, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that it still produces amazing photos, which I think is fantastic and should be the standard for any cinema camera to be able to take photos as easily and as efficient as the FX3. Other features that I really like, has a flip out screen. How good. And not only is it a flip out screen, but also it's a touch screen too. I really enjoyed using the touch screen, especially for autofocus tracking. It was very snappy, very easy to use. But in addition to that, sometimes with touchscreen cameras, you don't get the benefit of being able to navigate the menu with your hand, but you can utilize the touch screen to also navigate the menus, which makes it super easy. Furthermore, on the side, as standard, and as you would expect from Sony, it does have a dual CFexpress / SD card slot, so you can utilize both into each. Now, there are added benefits for using CFexpress. You can access more formats, higher frame rates. So if you do decide to shoot at for example, 4K, 120 frames per second, we do recommend using a CFexpress card. In addition, for the battery, it uses a Sony MP-FZ100, which is standard amongst the Sony A7 range. So if you are using a current day Sony A7 and you're looking to use a cinema camera, don't fret, you can use the batteries in this as well. In terms of ports, the FX3 has all your standard ports. You have a full-size HDMI port, you have a multi-USB port, you have a USB-C port too to allow for constant power, but also data transfer. You have a headphone and microphone port as well. Speaking about microphones, you do get a detachable top handle, which comes in the box. And what this will allow you to do is you can plug in some pro audio into it as well with the XLR ports. As a veteran in autofocus, I very much appreciate that you can just tap something and it just tracks. Dude, the webs look sick. One thing I've noticed that's really cool about this camera is that there are tally lights everywhere. In fact, there are 3. There's one for the front if you're going to be presenting. There's one at the top if you're going to be presenting from above. But there's also one at the back, which I think this looks super sick. It kind of looks like a brake light on like a race car, and I'm all about that. As you can see on the FX3, we have the included detachable top handle on the camera. Now, attaching this top handle not only gives you a much more ergonomic experience if you want to go for a lower angle or steady cam look, but you also get access to extra screw thread ports if you want to add extra accessories to the handle. And finally, you get to add pro audio as well, because it does come with 2 XLR inputs. And as standard, you do have a mixer on the side, so you can adjust the levels for your pro audio. All right, the shooting experience with the FX3 is fantastic. To me, personally, it's more familiar because it's just a standard camera. But what I like most about it, apart from the ability to use the top grip and have a, kind of standard camera grip, the features that you would need in video are all laid out on the camera, and you can access them all with the button, which minimizes your need to go into menus to do basically anything. You've got white balance, iris ISO on the top. You've got a gigantic record button here. And what I really like about the camera is that when you hit record, not only do the tally lights come up, but also a little bit of detail on the screen. It will highlight red around just to indicate that you're recording, not that 3 gigantic lights is already enough. But on top of that as well,
As I mentioned earlier, you do have access to all your features that you need. You've got a button for zebra, a button for peaking. You can use the wheel to adjust your shutter. Like, the ergonomics of it is great. The only one thing about this that is kind of a bit ergonomically questionable is the location of the joystick, which is on top. And now I don't really use the joystick much. When I navigate menus, it's a full touch screen and you can just use the D-pad, but the joystick at the top, if you're going to use that to navigate menus, highly don't recommend it. It's kind of in a weird spot. And I guess in autofocus, if you are going to use autofocus, adjusting points with this, you might have to take some time to get familiar with it. Otherwise, touching the screen is just as easy. So at least you have that option if you do prefer using a joystick.
So let's go through the actual samples in video and photo from the FX3. These are the settings we used. I'm not going to say them because they're a mouthful and I'm probably going to stumble, but I'm just going to say one thing. Everything that comes out of this camera is gold. The video looks fantastic, as you would expect from a Sony Cine camera. Everything looks so crisp and nice, and pair that with a full frame sensor, the images look fantastic. The full frame sensor gives you so much movement in terms of bokeh. Depth of field is really fun to play around, especially if you are going to be using a prime lens. Furthermore, low light performance is fantastic. In this 10.2 megapixel sensor, you can really push the dynamic range, but also the ISO performance. I tested it in both photo and video, and you could really see it in the photo samples that I took. You can really push the camera out to like a usable range of about 32,000. Even beyond that, it still looks pretty good. And unless you're pixel peeping, you can't really see the noise that bad. And most of it will look great after post-processing anyway. So in terms of the usability of the camera too, the autofocus was fantastic. As you know, in previous videos, I may not be the best person for manual focus, even though you get all these assist features like on the FX3, such as zebra and peaking, but I was really happy to see that the autofocus works well and very impressed with the tracking. At the time we were shooting a lot with the Metro coming through. I could just easily tap the screen from the Metro afar and it would track autofocus continuous the whole way through. And I thought that was fantastic and it's super easy to use. So my final thoughts on the FX3 before I wrap up the video. As at the time of this recording, we actually don't have a price on the FX3 because we did get it quite early. However, please head to our description and click onto the product page to get up-to-date pricing on the camera as well as details on availability. Secondly, just some extra minor feedback outside of the joystick on top. What really surprised us is that it doesn't have built-in ND filters, which is normally a standard in a cinema camera, which is just a little bit of a bummer for the FX3. Who I see this camera for? For people who are looking for one, a main cinema camera, or two, a B camera in an action format, whether you're mounting this on a car, whether you're mounting this on a gimbal. It's really beneficial with the form factor and the ability that you can add on accessories so easily, but also for content creators too. With a lot of YouTubers and a lot of people who stream on Twitch, for example, most of them do end up using just a standard mirrorless camera, but if you're looking for that extra flexibility and that extra power and that really cinematic look, especially YouTube content creators, the fact that you can shoot photos on this, really easy to shoot thumbnails, so we don't have to shoot screenshots, but the ability to shoot photos, take really good cinematic video, this is literally the all-in-one solution and it's super compact, has a flip screen for those selfies as well, and the overall aesthetic of it and the overall ergonomics of it just make it so good to mount it onto a gimbal or run around free roaming and getting the content that you need.